June 3rd, 1943. The sun beat down on the Tunisian desert with an intensity that turned metal too hot to touch and reduced shadows to thin lines beneath vehicles and equipment. Obergefreiter Wilhelm Kraus sat in the shade of a disabled half-track, watching the dust cloud raised by approaching American tanks grow larger on the horizon. He was 27 years old, a veteran of 3 years' service in the Afrika Korps, a soldier who had believed in discipline and duty and the inevitable superiority of German arms. Now, as the sound of diesel engines grew louder and the futility of further resistance became undeniable, those beliefs seemed as insubstantial as the heat shimmer dancing above the sand. The surrender came not with drama, but with exhaustion. His unit's ammunition was gone, their water nearly depleted, their vehicles out of fuel. When American infantry appeared with weapons ready but not threatening, Wilhelm stood slowly, raised his hands, and walked forward with the mechanical compliance of a man who understood that his war had ended. The Americans searched him efficiently, removed his pistol and paybook, and directed him toward a collection point where hundreds of other German soldiers sat in resigned silence. He expected brutality. The propaganda had been clear. Americans were undisciplined, racially mongrel, commanded by Jews, incapable of real military virtue. Their treatment of prisoners would reflect their degeneracy. Instead, the Americans gave them water from canteens, K rations from field packs, and medical attention for the wounded. A medic treated Wilhelm's sunburned face and dehydrated condition with the same care he might show his own men, speaking in broken German, offering aspirin and electrolyte powder without hostility. The journey to America took 5 weeks. First to a transit camp in Algeria, then aboard a Liberty ship that crossed the Atlantic in convoy, surrounded by destroyer escorts that spoke of naval power Wilhelm had been told did not exist. He spent the crossing in a cargo hold converted to prisoner transport, sleeping in bunks stacked 3 high, eating twice daily from American military rations that contained more calories than Afrika Korps soldiers had received in the final months of the campaign. He shared his space with Feldwebel Otto Brenner, a tank commander from Dusseldorf who maintained aggressive loyalty to the Führer even in captivity. Brenner spoke constantly of wonder weapons and inevitable counteroffensives of American weakness that would crumble under sustained German pressure. Wilhelm listened without comment, but doubt had already taken root. The ship carrying them was one of thousands built in American yards at impossible speed. The food they ate was abundant despite a 2-front war. The guards were professional, despite propaganda claims of American incompetence. Every tale contradicted what they had been taught. They arrived at Norfolk, Virginia, in mid-July. The port sprawled before them, alive with industry, cranes moving cargo, trucks in endless streams, ships being loaded and unloaded with mechanical precision. This was one American port, and it handled more tonnage than Hamburg had managed in its best peacetime years. The prisoners were formed into columns and marched to waiting trains, not cars or freight wagons, but passenger coaches with windows and padded seats. The train journey south lasted 2 days. Wilhelm pressed his face against the window, watching America reveal itself in the summer heat. What struck him most was the electric light. Every farm house blazed with illumination as darkness fell. Every town glowed through the night. In Germany, blackout regulations had plunged the Reich into darkness for 4 years. Here, Americans left lights burning, as if power were infinite, as if the war were happening in another universe. They arrived at Camp Dermot, Arkansas, on July 18, 1943. The camp sat among cotton fields and pine forests, wooden barracks arranged in neat rows behind double fences of barbed wire and watchtowers. It could hold 3,000 prisoners and had been constructed in 3 months. The barracks had electric lights, coal stoves for heating, and wooden floors that could be swept clean. There were latrines with running water, showers that provided hot water twice weekly, and a hospital staffed by German doctors working under American supervision. The camp commandant, a major named Harrison, addressed them in competent German on their first morning. "You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. You will receive adequate food, medical care, and shelter. You will work as the convention permits, and you will be paid 80 cents per day for your labor. Those who cooperate will find their time here passes without incident. Those who cause trouble will face appropriate discipline under American military justice." Wilhelm listened with the skepticism of a soldier trained to trust only verified facts. But as days became weeks, the promised treatment proved genuine. The food was adequate, sometimes generous: bread and soup twice daily, occasional meat, real coffee with sugar and canned milk. Breakfast included oatmeal or grits, bread with butter or margarine, coffee that actually tasted like coffee, rather than the roasted grain substitute standard in the Wehrmacht. Dinner brought stew or beans, bread, sometimes fruit from Red Cross parcels. The barracks had wooden bunks with thin mattresses, far better than what most prisoners had known in North Africa. The latrines functioned properly. The showers worked. Medical care was provided with supplies that exceeded what German field hospitals possessed. It was, in every measurable way, more comfortable than Wilhelm's service in the Afrika Korps had been. By August, prisoners were being assigned to work details throughout Arkansas. The state faced severe labor shortages. Farm workers enlisted or moved to defense factories. German POWs represented a solution: enemy soldiers who could be employed under international law while filling critical gaps in agricultural production. Wilhelm was assigned to a cotton plantation 20 miles from camp, owned by a family named Richardson. Each morning, a truck transported 15 prisoners to the plantation where they worked under minimal supervision, picking cotton in fields that stretched beyond the horizon. The work was brutal. Bent backs under the Arkansas sun, fingers bleeding from cotton bolls, heat that made breathing difficult. But it was honest labor, and Wilhelm found something almost dignified in the physical routine. James Richardson was in his 50s, a man who had worked this land for 3 generations, whose family had owned it since before the Civil War. He treated the German prisoners with neither hostility nor friendship, simply with the practical respect due to men doing necessary work. He provided water and rest breaks, shared his lunch occasionally, and paid the agreed wages without complaint. After 3 weeks, Richardson approached Wilhelm during a break. "You were a sergeant in your army." Wilhelm's English was basic but functional. "Yes, Obergefreiter. Same as your corporal." Richardson nodded. "I need someone to supervise the other prisoners. Make sure the work gets done right. Keep discipline. Prevent problems. You interested? Same pay, but less field work." "Yes," Wilhelm said, recognizing an opportunity for shade and authority. "I can do this." The role gave Wilhelm a strange dual status: prisoner and supervisor, enemy and enforcer of order. He organized work crews, settled disputes, ensured that quotas were met and equipment was maintained. The American guards watched, but rarely interfered, treating Wilhelm as a junior partner in maintaining productivity rather than as a potential threat requiring constant surveillance. The autumn harvest brought longer days and harder work as Richardson raced to bring in his cotton crop before weather turned. Wilhelm worked alongside American farmhands and black sharecroppers, experiencing the complex racial dynamics of the South without fully understanding them. The Germans were treated better than the black workers in many ways. Better food, better quarters when they stayed overnight during peak harvest. More respect from Richardson. The irony was not lost on Wilhelm. He had been taught that Americans were racially degenerate, yet here was a system that elevated white enemies above black citizens. One afternoon in October, Richardson made an announcement that changed everything. He gathered the prisoners and guards at the end of the workday, his face serious in the fading light. "We've got a problem," he said, looking directly at Wilhelm. "Thieves have been hitting plantations up and down the county, taking cotton, tools, whatever they can get. Last week, they hit the Morrison place and got away with 3 bales. Sheriff's got no manpower to patrol every farm. I need night watchmen." Wilhelm waited for Richardson to explain what arrangement he had made with the army, what additional guards would be posted. Instead, Richardson turned to the American lieutenant in charge of the guard detail. "Lieutenant Haskins and I have discussed this. We're going to try something unusual. I'm requesting permission to arm some of the prisoners, the reliable ones, to serve as camp police and night watchmen, just here on the plantation, supervised by my foreman, but armed, so they can actually stop anyone who tries to steal." The silence that followed was absolute. Wilhelm stared at Richardson, certain he had misunderstood the English. The other prisoners exchanged glances that mixed disbelief with something approaching fear. Arm prisoners? Give rifles to enemy soldiers? It was insane. Lieutenant Haskins, a young officer from Ohio, who had been classified 4F due to asthma, cleared his throat. "The commandant has approved this on a trial basis. 3 prisoners, selected for reliability, will be issued rifles, unloaded, with ammunition kept separately, and only distributed when on actual patrol duty. They'll work in pairs with my guards initially, then independently once they've proven trustworthy. Any misuse of weapons will result in immediate revocation and severe punishment." Richardson pointed at Wilhelm. "You'll be one of them. Pick 2 others you trust." That night, Wilhelm lay on his bunk in the camp barracks, staring at the ceiling, trying to process what had happened. He had been a soldier for 7 years. He had carried weapons across Poland and France and North Africa. He had believed absolutely in military discipline and the chain of command. And now, as a prisoner, an enemy held by a nation he had tried to destroy, he was being offered a rifle again, not to fight, but to guard, to protect American property, to be trusted. October 12th, 1943. Today the enemy offered to give me a weapon, not to kill, but to protect his farm from thieves. I do not understand this nation. In Germany, even our own citizens are not trusted with such responsibility, without constant oversight. Here, they give guns to prisoners and expect honor. Either they are fools, or they understand something about human nature that we never learned. Wilhelm selected Gefreiter Hans Müller, a farm boy from Bavaria who was steady and reliable, and Obergefreiter Ernst Vogel, a former policeman from Hamburg who understood discipline and authority. The three of them met with Lieutenant Haskins and Richardson's foreman, a tough old man named Carter who had served in the First World War and viewed the arrangement with skepticism but professional pragmatism. "Here's how this works," Carter said, standing in the plantation office with 3 rifles laid out on the desk before him. "These are Winchester Model 70s, bolt action, 5-round magazine. You'll patrol in pairs, one of you with Lieutenant Haskins, or one of my men, one working independently, but within shouting distance. You see anyone on the property who shouldn't be here, you challenge them. They don't stop. You fire a warning shot and raise the alarm. You do not, under any circumstances, shoot anyone unless they are actively trying to kill you or someone else. Clear?" "Clear," Wilhelm said, the other 2 echoing him. Carter handed Wilhelm a rifle. The weight was familiar, the balance slightly different from the Mauser he had carried, but close enough. He checked the action automatically, old training reasserting itself, confirming the weapon was unloaded and functional. "Ammunition stays locked up," Carter continued. "When you go on patrol, you'll be issued 5 rounds each. When patrol ends, you return the ammunition and the rifle. Any rounds fired must be accounted for with a written report. Any problems, any concerns, you come directly to me or the lieutenant. This is a privilege, not a right. You screw it up, you lose it, and probably face punishment. Understand?" "We understand," Wilhelm said. The first patrol was surreal. Wilhelm walked the perimeter of the cotton fields in the October darkness, a rifle slung over his shoulder, 5 rounds of ammunition in his pocket, working alongside an American corporal who seemed more interested in discussing baseball than watching for thieves. The night was cool and quiet, filled with the sounds of crickets and the distant barking of dogs. Wilhelm had patrolled before in occupied France, along the Mediterranean coast, across the Libyan desert, but always as a conqueror, always with the authority of the Wehrmacht behind him. Now he patrolled as something else, a prisoner given trust, an enemy offered responsibility, a man expected to honor an obligation freely given. Nothing happened that first night, or the second, or the third. But the fact that he was there, armed and trusted, changed something fundamental in Wilhelm's understanding of the world. The Americans had given him a weapon and expected him not to abuse it. They had offered responsibility and assumed he would meet it. This was not naivety, It was calculated risk based on a philosophy Wilhelm struggled to comprehend. By November, the arrangement had expanded. The camp commandant, hearing of the success at Richardson's plantation, authorized similar programs at other work sites where POW labor was critical and security concerns existed. German prisoners, who had proven reliable, were formed into camp police units within the POW compounds, maintaining order among their fellow prisoners, breaking up fights, preventing escapes, reporting problems to American authorities. Wilhelm was promoted to this internal police force, given an armband that marked his authority, and, incredibly, a rifle to carry while on duty within the compound. The weapon was kept unloaded, ammunition secured in the American armory, but the symbolism was profound. He was a prisoner with a gun, an enemy trusted to maintain order, a soldier stripped of his army, but given a new kind of authority. The role brought strange responsibilities. He broke up fights between hardcore knees and those prisoners who had begun questioning the ideology that had led Germany to ruin. He prevented escape attempts not through force, but through reason, explaining to desperate men that escape in rural Arkansas meant almost certain recapture and probable death if they encountered hostile civilians. He mediated disputes over bunk assignments and work details, using authority granted by captors to govern fellow captives. One evening in December, a fight erupted in the barracks. Two prisoners, one a committed the other a man who had begun attending voluntary English classes and reading American newspapers, came to blows over politics and duality. The Ming accused the other of a treason, of collaboration, of betraying the fatherland. The fight escalated quickly, drawing in others, threatening to become a full riot. Wilhelm waded into the chaos without hesitation. He didn't draw his unloaded rifle. That would have been meaningless theater. Instead, he used the authority of his voice and his reputation, shouting commands in German, physically separating combatants, restoring order through the sheer force of his presence and the respect he had earned. When Lieutenant Haskins arrived with American guards, the situation was already under control. Wilhelm stood in the center of the barracks, breathing hard, his uniform torn, a cut above his eye bleeding slowly, but the fight was over. Haskins surveyed the scene, then looked at Wilhelm. What happened? Political disagreement, Wilhelm said in careful English. Became physical. Is now finished. You handled it? Yes. Haskins nodded slowly. Good work, Obergefreiter. The commandant will hear about this. December 8th, 1943. Tonight I stopped a riot among my fellow prisoners using only authority and respect, not force. The Americans watched, but did not interfere, trusting me to handle it. I have been a soldier for 7 years, but I have never felt so responsible as I do now, carrying an enemy's rifle to protect his property and maintain order among my own people. This is power of a different kind, not the power to command obedience through fear, but the power to lead through trust. I begin to understand why America is winning this war. The Christmas of 1943 brought an unexpected development. The camp received packages from American churches and civic organizations. gifts for enemy prisoners that included cigarettes, candy, toiletries, books, and games. Local families invited small groups of POWs to Christmas dinner in their homes, though few prisoners accepted out of a mixture of pride and uncertainty. The Richardson family sent a package specifically for Wilhelm and his fellow watchmen: homemade cookies, warm socks, and a letter thanking them for protecting the plantation. Wilhelm read the letter multiple times, trying to understand the mentality that would thank enemy prisoners for doing work they were essentially compelled to do. Mrs. Richardson had written it herself, her handwriting careful and clear. "We know you are far from home and family this Christmas. We want you to know that your honest work and responsible behavior are noticed and appreciated. You have shown that even in war, men can act with honor and dignity. We pray for your families and for peace." The gesture was small, but profound. It acknowledged his humanity, recognized his effort, and offered grace where none was required. It was in its way more disorienting than any combat he had experienced. By spring of 1944, the trust extended further. Wilhelm and selected other prisoners were allowed to patrol work sites independently, armed but unsupervised, expected to maintain security and report any problems. They were given responsibilities that exceeded what many German soldiers had known under their own officers. The irony was not lost on Wilhelm. He had more autonomy as a prisoner in America than he had ever possessed as a citizen of the Reich. The work was not without incident. One night in March, while patrolling the Richardson plantation, Wilhelm encountered two men attempting to steal tools from the equipment barn. He challenged them as trained, ordering them to stop and identify themselves. When they fled instead, he fired a warning shot into the air and raised the alarm. Richardson's foreman and the American guards responded within minutes. The thieves were caught, arrested by local sheriff's deputies, and prosecuted under Arkansas law. Wilhelm had to give a deposition, a surreal experience where he testified in broken English about protecting American property from American criminals. Richardson thanked him personally the next day. "You did good work last night. Saved me probably $1,000 in equipment. I've told the commandant that you and your men are the best security I've ever had." The commendation from Richardson resulted in Wilhelm receiving a small bonus payment, an extra dollar added to his camp account, a trivial sum that meant everything because it represented recognition of merit rather than simple compliance. March 15th, 1944. Last night, I fired a weapon in defense of enemy property. I protected an American's barn from American thieves. The enemy thanked me and paid me extra wages for doing so. I have crossed some line I cannot uncross. I am still a prisoner, still technically an enemy, but I am also something else. A man trusted with responsibility, a soldier without an army, but with a duty voluntarily honored. I do not know what this makes me, but I know I am not the same man who surrendered in Tunisia. The ideological divisions within the camp grew more pronounced as the war turned decisively against Germany. Hardcore Nice maintained their loyalty through intimidation and violence, holding secret meetings, enforcing discipline, punishing those who cooperated too enthusiastically with Americans. But their influence waned with every passing month. Every piece of news from Europe showing the Wehrmacht in retreat. Every act of American trust that proved propaganda false. Wilhelm found himself increasingly aligned with those prisoners who had begun questioning everything they had been taught. Not openly, that would invite violence from the fanatics, but in quiet conversations after lights out, in shared glances during propaganda speeches, in the accumulation of small betrayals as men stopped pretending to believe in ultimate German victory. The trust given by the Americans had accomplished what no amount of propaganda could have achieved. It had shown them an alternative to the authoritarian control they had known their entire lives. It had demonstrated that men treated with dignity generally responded with honor. That responsibility freely given was usually faithfully executed. That trust was not weakness, but a form of strength no dictatorship could replicate. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. The camp loudspeakers broadcast news of Germany's unconditional surrender, and 3,000 prisoners stood in stunned silence, processing the end of everything they had fought for. Some wept. Others stood stone-faced. A few fanatics insisted it was propaganda, that the war continued. But even they sounded hollow. Wilhelm felt primarily relief. The killing had stopped. The destruction would end. His nation had lost, but the madness was finished. He thought of his wife and children in Hamburg, wondered if they had survived the bombing, hoped that the occupation would treat German civilians with a fraction of the humanity that had been extended to prisoners like himself. The repatriation process took over a year. Wilhelm remained at Camp Dermot through 1945 and into 1946, continuing his work on the Richardson plantation, maintaining order as camp police, waiting for his turn to board ships returning to Europe. During those months, he watched the camp slowly empty as prisoners were processed and sent home, watched the guard towers gradually abandoned, watched the careful order of military captivity dissolve into the administrative tedium of peacetime transition. When his turn finally came, Richardson drove Wilhelm to the processing center personally. They rode in silence for most of the journey, two men who had worked together for 3 years, who had developed something like respect despite the categories of enemy and prisoner. "You're a good man, Wilhelm," Richardson said as they approached the gate. "Honest worker, fair supervisor. If things were different, I'd offer you a permanent job. But I know you need to go home, need to find your family." "Thank you," Wilhelm said, his English fluent now after 3 years of practice. "For everything. For trusting me, for showing me that there is another way to live." They shook hands at the gate. Wilhelm walked through, carrying only a small bag of possessions and a folder of documents certifying his work history and conduct. He did not look back. The voyage to Europe took 2 weeks, arriving in Bremen in September 1946. Wilhelm processed through a British-run facility, received papers authorizing his travel within occupied Germany, and began the journey north to Hamburg through a landscape of destruction that exceeded anything he had imagined. Cities reduced to rubble, infrastructure shattered, millions displaced and desperate, He found his family living in 2 rooms of a partially destroyed apartment building, his wife and 2 children surviving on occupation rations and the black market. His wife wept when he walked through the door. His children, older now by 3 years, stared at him with a mixture of recognition and uncertainty, trying to reconcile memory with presence. The rebuilding took years. Wilhelm found work as a supervisor in reconstruction projects, his English and organizational skills making him valuable to occupation authorities and German contractors alike. He watched Germany transform under occupation and later independence, watched democracy slowly take root in soil that had known only authoritarianism, watched his nation learn painfully what freedom meant and what it required. He never forgot Arkansas. He corresponded with Richardson until the plantation owner's death in 1962. Letters that spoke of crops and weather and children growing up. He kept the letter from Mrs. Richardson, yellowed and fragile, in a box with his discharge papers and work certificates. He kept the memory of walking night patrol with a rifle. An enemy prisoner trusted with a weapon, given responsibility, and expected to honor it. Years later, when his children asked about the war, when his grandchildren wanted to know what captivity had been like, he told them about the rifles and the trust. They gave me a gun, he said, though I was their enemy. Not to kill, but to guard. Not because they were fools, but because they believed trust was stronger than fear. They believed that men, even enemies, would respond to dignity with honor. And they were right. I protected their property better than I had protected my own nation's interests, because they trusted me to do so, and that trust meant everything. He told them about firing a warning shot to stop thieves, about breaking up riots without violence, about walking patrols in the Arkansas darkness, carrying an American rifle, and feeling more responsible than he ever had as a Wehrmacht soldier. That was the moment I understood the true meaning of freedom, he said. It is not the absence of constraint. It is the presence of trust. It is being given responsibility and expected to meet it. The Americans did not give us guns because they were careless. They did it because they understood that trust transforms men in ways that control never can. Wilhelm Kraus died in 1981, having lived to see Germany reunified under democracy, having watched his children grow up in a free society, having witnessed his nation transform from totalitarian state to liberal democracy. In his effects was a photograph of the Richardson plantation, a faded image of cotton fields stretching to the horizon, and a small brass object, a single point .30-06 cartridge, unfired, that he had kept from his patrol duty in 1944. The cartridge represented something profound, not the violence it could have unleashed, but the trust it symbolized. Trust that an enemy could be armed and expected to use that weapon responsibly. Trust that prisoners could maintain order among themselves. Trust that men given dignity would generally respond with honor. That trust had been a gift more valuable than freedom itself. It had shown Wilhelm what strength really looked like, what freedom really meant, And what kind of society could extend mercy even to those it fought against? The Americans had given guns to prisoners and received loyalty in return. They had offered responsibility and received honor. They had trusted enemies and created, in many cases, something like friends. The story of German prisoners armed by their captors seemed almost absurd in its improbability. But it was true, documented in military records and personal accounts. It was real, a strange chapter in the history of war, when the enemy showed more faith in human dignity than ideology ever had. And for those who experienced it, that faith changed everything. It proved that trust was not weakness, that mercy was not naivety, that a nation confident in its principles could extend grace even to enemies and be stronger for it. Wilhelm had carried an American rifle as a prisoner and returned it faithfully at the end of every shift. He had been trusted with weapons and had honored that trust completely. And in that exchange, trust given and trust repaid, he had discovered what real strength looked like. It was not the strength to compel obedience through fear. It was the strength to offer trust and believe it would be honored. It was the confidence to treat enemies as men capable of decency. It was the wisdom to know that human dignity, once recognized and respected, generally proved worthy of that respect. The Americans had given him a gun, and in doing so, they had given him something far more important, proof that another way of living was possible, proof that societies built on trust were stronger than those built on fear, proof that freedom and responsibility were inseparable, that one could not exist without the other. That lesson, learned while carrying an American rifle through Arkansas nights, had shaped the rest of Wilhelm's life. It had shown him what kind of Germany could be built from the ruins of the old one. It had given him hope that his children might grow up in a society that valued trust over control, dignity over domination, freedom over fear. The rifle had been returned long ago, but the trust it represented remained, a permanent part of who Wilhelm had become. The enemy had armed him, and in that impossible gesture had won a victory more complete than any battlefield could provide. They had shown a prisoner what freedom looked like, and that prisoner, transformed by what he had experienced, had carried those lessons home to help build a better Germany. The trust had been repaid, not in betrayal or escape, but in transformation. And that, perhaps, was the point all along.